Okay, good morning, people. Hope everyone's doing okay. If you're here in Vancouver, you'll see it's kind of cloudy and rainy today, which sometimes happens in Vancouver. Um, let's see, so Baja's here already, or at least I hope he's still here. Good morning to you. Monica's here. Morning, Monica. Mashid is here. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, KC. And Thika's here. Good, I guess it's evening for you, Thika, but hello. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Morning, Jenna. Um, I'll just give us another minute or two to see if we can get some more people in here. And then we'll get going, okay? Oh, Manish is here. Good morning. Wow, you called me sir. How formal. I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. What can I tell you? Well, maybe I'll tell you what we'll do today. Today we will finish up the talk about oppression and privilege and internalized dominance and oppression. We'll finish talking about that. Those topics may be clear to you and they may not, but I think they'll become clear as we go further, as we have some better examples to illustrate them. And so I don't want to go too far into giving examples because we want to sort of save that for the specific types of oppression that we'll study going forward. And so we'll try to finish that up really quickly, and then we'll start on the racism stuff, which we agreed to start on and is pretty timely and pertinent now, right? Erica's here. Good morning, Erica. Okay, so let's dive right in. Let's do this. So yesterday we were talking about privilege, and we said that privilege is a way that that advantages or favors or benefits members of dominant groups at the expense of minoritized groups, right? And we said that sometimes this happens on a personal level, sometimes it happens on an institutional or a cultural level, and in many cases privilege is invisible to the people who have it. And so often people who have privilege, again, either don't feel it or don't know it, and in some cases people with privilege will deny that privilege exists because because again they don't perceive it, they don't feel it, they don't see it working, and so sometimes it's a very complicated thing to talk about and to understand, but it does exist. It is a thing, okay? The other thing we said about privilege is that the advantages that the dominant group gets, they get whether they like it or not, okay? And so I use myself as an example. I'm living in a country where white people and men are the dominant group. As a result, I have probably benefited from that in numerous ways. But the problem is that I cannot point to a specific instance where I knew that my privilege was helping me, okay? And again, it's not always obvious. And so, and of course, the other thing is that it doesn't matter whether I agree with that or not. And so whether I believe that inequalities in society should be rectified and we should aim for an equitable society, which I do believe in, whether I believe that or not, it doesn't matter. I still benefit from the way that society is structured and the social messages that are circulating around. Good morning, Ivan. Yeah, so people with privilege are generally unaware that they have it. And so again, I use this metaphor of the fish. If the fish is swimming with the current, then it doesn't really feel the current around its body. It just feels like it's swimming normally and going about its business. But if the fish turns against the current, then it feels it, right? It's harder to get where you're going. And so to move with the current is to have privilege and to not have privilege is to sort of be swimming against the current sometimes. We talked very briefly about external and structural dimensions of privilege. So the idea here is that dominant groups are the dominant group norms are integrated into the structures of society. So one of the easy ways to see this is to look at people who have different abilities or different bodies. Society, for the most part, is constructed for people who are able-bodied, who can walk and use their arms and can see and hear and speak. And so if you are not part of that group, if you use a wheelchair, if you can't see, if you can't hear, then society is not necessarily constructed for you. And so there's going to be a lot of obstacles in your way in sort of going about your life and living your life. Even a trip to the grocery store, if you're in a wheelchair, there are a number of barriers that you have to find your way around, whether they be curb cuts or whether they be finding a taxi that will accommodate your chair, or having a car in which you can drive. Pushing a basket with a wheelchair is kind of not very possible or very difficult. And so this is all evidence that the world is constructed for people who can walk around and push carts like you and me. But people who are using wheelchairs or who have different abilities, they are going to encounter issues. They're going to encounter obstacles. Things are going to be more difficult for them to do. And so we, us able-bodied people, we kind of have privilege in that regard, because the world is built for people like us, and it is less built for people with different abilities, okay? The construction of what's normal and not normal by the dominant group. And so we'll see this in a couple of different places, but dominant groups are generally seen as normal. So they're seen as kind of the default. They're often seen as, if we look at race, which we're about to, white people are often seen as being not ethnic or not cultured or not racialized, because they have because they are assumed to be the normal situation. I'm not doing a very good job explaining this. Let's just leave it for now. I'm not gonna make it worse. Dominant groups are seen as the default, as kind of the normal, the normal version of whatever you're talking about, whichever sort of social group you're talking about. And finally, the invisibility of privilege. We talked about that already. Now, privilege has internal effects as well, both on people in dominant groups and people. Oh, Krish is here. Good morning, Krish. People in dominant groups and people in minoritized groups. And so, again, in dominant groups, people tend to believe that they have the right to their position, whatever it is. Often they have internalized messages of their group's superiority. Sometimes they lack humility about their limited knowledge of minoritized groups. And again, their privilege is often invisible to them, okay? And so we talked about these two things. Internalized dominance refers to internalized or acting out the constant messages that you and your group are superior to the minoritized group, and that's often evident in microaggressions. And so I had you watch that video on microaggressions, and as you saw, they spoke to a collection of young people, different genders, different races and ethnicities, and you heard some of the things that get asked of them very commonly. And so I don't know if anyone felt brave enough to do this, but does anyone feel that they have experienced microaggressions? Have people kind of said things like this to you that you either at the time you kind of noticed was a little bit hurtful or inappropriate, or maybe that you didn't really think about? What do you think? Have somebody made comments like this to you, or have you heard comments like this made to other people? What do you think? Yes, okay. Can you give me a little more than that, maybe? Maybe. Oh, so Karen says, yeah, okay. Can you give me a little more, maybe? If that's okay. If you don't feel comfortable, that's okay too, but okay. Okay. Um, okay. So, so Karen says, you don't sound like you're from Africa. That's a good one. Um, these little microaggressions are interesting. Karen, if I could follow up with you, how, when when someone said this to you, when they said you don't sound like you're from Africa, how how did that make you feel, if you don't mind my asking? How'd that make you feel? And other people, if you want to join in here and add some microaggressions, if you have heard them, that'd be fantastic too. But because that's a good one, Karen. For many of you, and I could be wrong here, but I'm gonna guess, many of you might not have experienced microaggressions in terms of race or ethnicity if you are born and live in a country where you're sort of the dominant group, right? So if you're from Iran and you're Iranian, then you're not going to experience microaggressions about your race or ethnicity in Iran, right? Because you're in the dominant group, right? It's only in places where you are in a minoritized group that you may experience these. So Karen says it made you feel bad because it's like they expected you to speak weirdly or to not know English. Yeah. So yeah, and yeah, and I understand how that makes you feel bad too, right? Because the kind of meaning behind that is, yeah, is in you don't sound like you're from Africa means that, you know, if I were to say that to you, it would be like, I know how Africans sound and you're not that, right? So why don't you fit my stereotype, right? Why don't you behave like I think you should, right? And so it's almost me trying to sort of force my stereotypical idea on you, right? And saying, why don't you live up to my beliefs, right? And it's hurtful, right? Because people don't want to be seen as stereotypes. They want to be seen as who they are, right? Ba says here, this go back to your country, yeah. And unfortunately, that's one that's hurtful in a number of ways depending on who you are. Sometimes people who hear the sort of go back to your country, are people who were born in the country that they're in. And so, saying to someone who was, saying someone who is ethnically Chinese, who might have been born in Vancouver, and then someone says, go back to your country. Well, this is their country, right? And so behind that idea is kind of, the idea that you don't belong here, right? Because I see your race or your ethnicity or your religion, and our country is not that. So go somewhere else, right? So it's kind of a rejection, right? It's a saying you don't belong in the group. And Baha, I know you're not born in Canada, but it's equally hurtful because it's the same thing, right? It's the same idea that you don't belong, right? You're not one of us. Yeah, so it's known for most of us that teenagers have. Okay. I'm not sure. I guess it's I'm not positive on that one, Baha. If it's a microaggression or if it's just kind of a not nice thing to say. It could be. I might have to think about that one. But it's not very nice, right? And it makes people feel self-conscious about themselves, right? But yeah, go back to your country is like it's a statement that you don't belong here, right? Is that Canada or the US, we are a country of white people, of Christians, and you people over here, you don't belong and you need to go somewhere else, right? And again, that rejection is hurtful, whether you're born in Canada and you are Canadian or whether you aren't, right? Excluding someone from a social group is actually a pretty severe punishment for humans. Remember when we talked about socialization, when people break social rules, often the way we punish them is we exclude them from our group, right? Maybe we don't talk to them, or we kind of stand a little further away, or we ignore them. If you think about in greater society, when someone actually commits a crime, like if you murder someone, how do we punish them? Well, we socially exclude them, right? We take them and we put them in a building where they can't interact with the rest of us out here in society, right? We socially exclude them by putting them in jail. And so social exclusion is a very powerful punishment for all humans. And in some ways it kind of sounds, it sounds a little bit silly, right? It sounds like it shouldn't really be an effective punishment, but it actually is, right? Human beings are social creatures, and so when we feel that we are excluded from the group, when we feel we're being rejected, that's actually really hurtful. And a lot of those, that's okay, Caleb. A lot of microaggressions that you hear are statements that, either you don't belong in our group and you need to go away, or why don't you fit into your group? Why don't you fit into my stereotype, right? If I know what Africans are supposed to sound like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you sound like that, right? And so, but these things can be hurtful, right? And if you looked at the statistic they showed you in the video and you do the math, the estimate is that these kids are getting 3 of these comments every single day, right? And so, again, on the surface, they might not seem very hurtful, but they are kind of hurtful. They do upset people, and they happen all the time, right? And so, again, if you're hearing a microaggression, once a year, okay. But if you're hearing it on average 3 times a day, every day, that's a lot, right? That's a lot of negative feeling that you are perceiving. That's a lot of messages that you don't belong, that you're different, that you don't fit our stereotypes, right? And so it's a It's a lot of negativity to feel, right? Yeah, so some of them, we heard some microaggressions in the video. Again, there's some other ones listed here, which I won't kind of go into. I think the kids in the video did a much better job of talking about this than my slide does. But there's lots of other ones too. And again, I won't go through all of them, but it is important to, maybe I'll let you read those on your own if you look at the lecture slides, but the important part is the message, right? It's not so much what people say, it's what the message behind that statement is, right? And so, oh, where are you from? Well, you're not American or Canadian. You're not one of us. In the second box there, you're so articulate, right? And again, the message is that, oh, a person of your race or ethnicity or gender, shouldn't be as intelligent or articulate as white people. And so to say you're so articulate is like a surprise when it really shouldn't be, right? Again, this one, when I look at you, I don't see color. Well, that kind of denies a major part of someone's identity, and it denies their experience as living in that color of skin within a society, right? So there's all kinds of microaggressions here, and again, I won't go through all of them, and there's certainly more. But again, consider. Wow, there is quite a bit. The problem is that these statements seem innocent, but the message behind them is not, and people can make these statements without really realizing the message that they're transmitting. And again, they're hurtful to people, right? Especially when you are subject to these microaggressions multiple times a day, every day, right? It becomes a lot. And so the last thing I'll say here is internalized oppression. And so this is where a minoritized group starts to act out the messages that their group are inferior to the dominant group. And again, this might seem a little bizarre, but I want to remind you of Jane Elliott's experiment in her classroom with the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids. That's exactly what happened, right? The brown-eyed kids were told that they were smarter and better, and so they acted out their internalized dominance. They acted better, and they discriminated against the kids with blue eyes, right? And the blue-eyed kids, and this is maybe the most interesting part, the blue-eyed kids started to act out what they received, what they sort of learned about themselves too, is that Jane Elliott said that blue-eyed kids were not as smart and not as good. And so they internalized those ideas and they started to act them out. And that's internalized oppression, when people constantly get social messages about how they are or how their group is, and then they start to subconsciously believe it. They start to kind of buy into it. And so there's lots of ways in which internalized oppression can play out. And again, I'll probably leave most of these and we'll talk about them a little bit later as they come up, okay? And again, there's another chart here which I'll let you read another time. There's lots and lots here, but again, this is kind of how privilege plays out in terms of how people behave, okay? And so people with privilege often act in these types of ways. People in oppressed positions, people in minoritized groups often see or behave in these sorts of ways. And so that's kind of how privilege appears when we see people act out. But I'll let you read it on your own. Okay. Let's talk racism. So before we dive into this one, obviously this is a very emotionally charged topic. Obviously, it is a very relevant topic to what's going on in the United States right now, and in Canada and globally, right? As the protests about George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death before that, those protests have kind of gone global. And so currently, this is very much, racism is very much in the spotlight in the news. So it's obviously a very emotional topic, but it's also a very complicated topic as well. It would be very easy to talk about racism and deal with racism if racism was simply the fault of a few racists, right? If we had a group of racists here, we know they're bad, we can somehow deal with that, right? That would be easy. But the problem with racism is that there are many elements and dimensions to it. And so, yes, we have a few people that are racists, but we also have what we'll talk about a little bit later. We also have systemic racism. And so we have a society that is organized in a way that benefits some groups, white people, and disadvantages other groups of color. And that disadvantage, well, that sort of relationship of advantage and disadvantage plays out in terms of laws and government policies. We find evidence of it in healthcare, we find evidence of it in education, we find evidence of it in the workplace, we find evidence of it in terms of social media and entertainment. It's kind of everywhere. And so that's really the difficulty with talking about racism, is because it's a very complicated problem with a long history. And so it becomes very difficult to sort of put your finger on it and say, here's the problem right here, it's this. There's actually lots of problems that need to be fixed and lots of things that need to be discussed. And so the danger here is that we won't be able to do a really comprehensive job of describing the problem because it's so complicated. And there's a danger that we will overlook some things. And that's just because it's very complicated and we don't have months and months to deal with this particular issue. So we'll do our best to kind of cover racism and understand how it works, knowing that we will definitely miss some things. The second thing I want to say about racism is that, or the racism unit here, is that sometimes the way I teach this is I try to be reasonably neutral. I want you to kind of understand how social inequalities work, like racism and sexism and things, on kind of an academic level. And so I want to be kind of at the front of the class, or the front of this virtual class, kind of explaining to you how things work in a sort of a very measured way. Sometimes I make jokes about things because I'm trying to be entertaining. But just in case you're confused about that, I do believe that racism is wrong. I do believe we have a significant problem with racism, both in the United States and in Canada. And those things need to be rectified. Those things are not, the things that people are protesting about in the US and in Canada and around the world are not imaginary. They are not insignificant. And they're highly, highly disturbing, and they need to be remedied immediately. And so just in case, as we kind of go through this, and I'm trying to sort of pull these things apart in an academic way, just know where I stand, okay? Know where I stand. I support an equitable, equal society. Racism is bad. Yeah. Okay. So maybe, well, let's dive in here. Let's dive in. So we've said that racism is a type of oppression. And so again, it's a set of policies and practices and traditions and norms and all these things that systematically work together to exploit one group and benefit another one, okay? And We said, of course, that this is a little different from prejudice and discrimination, although it's connected to prejudice and discrimination, in that oppression operates at a societal level. So nobody has to do anything specifically in order to participate in oppression, but of course some people actively do. And again, when these things are, because we see oppression in so many different places, it's very easy to take it for granted. It's very easy to see it as just the way things are. But often that's not true. Often oppression has very clear reasons for why society is structured the way it is. And so it's not accidental, and it's not natural. It is a function of how societal systems are formed, okay? Now, let me ask you a few quick questions that I'm curious about your answers to. Maybe not what is race, I'll leave that, but maybe answer this question for me. So, what race are you, and who gets to say? Okay? Who gets to say, or do you know which race you are, and who gets to say what race you are? What do you think about that? Do you know what race you are, and who gets to say? I'm pretty sure I know what race I am, and I know who gets to say, but I'm curious what you think. Okay, Sabah says you're Arabic race, okay. Wasn't like the general or the smallest group? It's up to you. It's up to you. Yeah, not sure how to answer the second part. Yeah, so who gets to say who belongs to what race? That's a more difficult question for sure. Maybe I'll also ask you, can you change races? Can you change races? Can you go from one race to being another race, or are you just stuck? And anyone can answer this, by the way. I know there's a bunch of you watching, and there's only a few of you responding, so come on. So Casey says she doesn't think so. Doesn't think you can change races. Okay. Let's see. So, do you know what race you are? Who gets to say, and can you change? Erica says she thinks no, can't switch. Manish says you can't change, but maybe you can change beliefs you had on the race you believe. Yeah, okay. Yeah, certainly your beliefs can change for sure. But you say no, okay. You can change tribes if you have the same appearance, okay. So those might be two different levels of organization. Karen, so you have I guess a broader race, but within that you have different tribes that are recognized, right? So you're saying, I guess, depending on your appearance, you might be able to move from one to the other. Okay. Baha says no one can change their race because it's been going on for hundreds of years. Okay, so there's this idea that what the races are have been defined for a long period, and therefore, you know, if you're in one race, we kind of know what that race is, and so you very clearly belong to it. Okay. Interesting. Let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask you, is race meaningful? Yeah. Is race meaningful? Does it mean something? Is it important? Is it significant? Yeah, is it meaningful? All right, so Baha says yes. Casey says yes. Absolutely. That's a strong yes. Anish says yes. Okay. Okay, Karen says not really. All right. Jenna says yes. Okay. Okay, so whether you're thinking yes or no or maybe, in a way you're all right. Race is meaningful, and at the same time, not so much. But I'll try and explain to you how that works. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start at the beginning. Okay, now we'll start off this conversation by saying that racism is an emotionally charged issue in society. And again, we don't have to look any further than the news to see how much emotion there is surrounding this particular topic. And it's a difficult topic to discuss for a number of reasons. And the first one, hopefully we will fix this in the next couple weeks, at least for ourselves anyway. One of the issues is that there is miseducation about what racism is and how it works. And again, I mentioned two Canadian individuals, I think Rex Murphy and Stockwell Day yesterday. They've written articles and made comments that people have reacted very strongly against. And I think part of the reason is that they are showing that they are somewhat miseducated about what racism is and how it works. It's difficult to talk about because people kind of don't know quite what they're talking about. The second reason it's difficult to discuss is that there are institutional and economic interests in upholding racism. And so we'll dig into this a little more, I guess a little bit later this week, that the social structure and the economic structure of many countries is created in such a way that some people are advantaged and others are disadvantaged. And so there is people who are in dominant groups, people who are benefited by racism, often don't want to give up those benefits. They don't want to lose the privilege and advantage and position in society that they have. And so people will often excuse racism or make or sort of explain it away because they don't want to lose kind of what they have. Third, that there are ideologies floating around such as colorblindness and individualism. And so again, we said when people say they're colorblind, we don't mean for real. We mean that some people claim that when they look at someone, they don't see their race or ethnicity. They don't see color. And again, the problem with that is, number one, of course you do. Unless you are unless you are legally blind, you do see this color of someone's skin. It's impossible not to. But secondly, the problem with that is that you're kind of ignoring an important part of someone's identity, and you're ignoring an important way in which that person experiences society. Because societies treat us differently because of the color of our skin, people of various skin colors have different experiences in society. And so by saying, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, you are discounting or choosing not to see that person's experience, okay? The other part of that is individualism. So the idea that people are just individuals. Social groups don't matter. Everyone gets where they are because of their individual characteristics. And again, not quite true. Emotional attachment to those opinions that protect our worldview. Yeah, so sometimes we don't want to see things differently than we think they are. And finally, it's difficult to talk about this topic because there are very real negative effects on minoritized groups. It is a real thing, and it has very negative consequences. And so people have very strong emotional reactions to discussing racism, and rightly so. Now, some people, although not so much right now, but many people wanted to believe or felt that we live in a post-racial society here in North America. And so the idea is that, you know, racism is a thing that happened in the past. Yes, people were racist, you know, decades ago, but now we're all beyond that, right? We're all living in an equal society. The US had a black president before. Everything's cool now, right? Which is not true. In some ways, some things have improved, but we are by no means a society without racism here in Canada or in the US. And so it's still a pervasive factor in both of our societies here in North America, but also around the world. I'm going to point the finger at Donald Trump here, and I'm going to say that things have, in terms of racism and incidents involving race and hate crimes, those have actually increased since he was elected. And so we've seen an increase in anti-Semitic activity. Trump's travel ban, which wasn't a travel ban, this is a few years ago now, that travel ban was predominantly, almost exclusively, against Muslim countries. Minoritized groups in the US, such as Black Americans and American Muslims, and of course, being Muslim is not a race, it's a religion, but sometimes they're sort of put into the same category here. People have felt less comfortable in the United States since Donald Trump was elected. And of course, as of this month, we see very prominent protests around the world connected to the murder of George Floyd and to Breonna Taylor a few weeks ago. Now, I've used these two words already, race and ethnicity, and we should know that they are different, okay? So this is what we'll say race is. We'll say that race is a social distinction, okay? It's a social distinction, and it's based on visual information. And so it could be the color of our skin, it could be the shape of our eyes or how our hair grows, could be the shape of our nose or the general shape of our face. All of these things can result in us being classified into one race or another, right? So they're all physical characteristics. Skin color is one part of it, but there are others as well. We'll say that ethnicity is something different, okay? So your ethnicity is connected to cultural differences. And so your language, your religion, your connection to a group of people and their shared history. Okay? So to have an ethnicity is to be connected to a place in the world and a culture and a language and a sense of shared history. But race is kind of just your physical appearance, and that physical appearance leads people to sort of put you into one race category or another. Okay. Okay. So we've been working really hard here. Let's take a little break. And when we come back, we'll dive in a little deeper. Okay. So quick break, and I'll see you just a few minutes. Okay, and we're back. So, we started talking about race, and the first thing we did was to try to identify what race was and, of course, distinguish it from ethnicity, because they're two different things, right? And we said that race was based on our physical characteristics, so the color of our skin, shape of our eyes, the way our hair grows, maybe the way our face is shaped, or our nose, or something like that. Physical characteristics that allow people to kind of put us into one category or another, right? Whereas our ethnicity is different, right? Our ethnicity is connected to our culture, to our religion, to the country that we belong to and the history of that country. Those things are all ethnicity, okay? So they're two different things. Sometimes they overlap quite a bit, and so, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're separate, but they are two different things, okay? So, we often think of race as a biological thing. And again, that's not surprising because basically our physical bodies are determined by our biology, by our genetics, right? So humans are organisms, right? We're biological organisms, and what we are, everything we are is encoded in our DNA, right? So within our DNA, within our 23 chromosomes, there are 200 to 300,000 genes, okay? And these genes here encode everything about us, from our appearance to the way our physiology works. Everything about us biologically is determined here, okay? Now, what a biologist would say when talking about race in humans, a biologist would say, well, there's really no such thing. There are genetic differences between humans, right? We are all genetically unique, but the things that we see on the outside, and so the things like the color of our skin and the shape of our eyes and racial markers, if you will, those are adaptive traits in many cases, and they don't really signal a different biological race. So what I'm talking about here is that for some traits, the reason that we look different has to do with our environment. And so the easiest example here is this color of skin, okay? The original kind of color for human skin is black, right? Or it's a very, very dark brown. And the reason for that is that humans evolved in Africa. And Africa, as you clearly know, is an equatorial country. The place where humans evolved is kind of very sunny and very warm. And so what you need if you're living in that part of the world is you need some protection from the sun, right? The sun is very, very intense around the equator. You need some protection. And so what you'll probably notice is that people who come from equatorial areas, wherever they come from in the world, they tend to have darker skin. And again, that darker skin is a protection against the sun. It's a protection against UV rays. But as humans kind of left Africa and started to migrate to other parts of the world, eventually they found themselves in areas that were not quite as sunny. And so my ancestors, for instance, come from Northern Europe, mostly from Britain, some from Ireland, maybe some from Scandinavian countries, who knows? But all of those places are not especially sunny, right? They're much cooler, often they're rainy, sometimes they're snowy. And so in a situation like that, protection from the sun is not what you need. What you need is skin that's kind of transparent, because that actually lets the sunlight through, and that's important for the synthesis of vitamin D, which you need. And so skin colors don't have anything to do with races. They just simply have to do with an adaptation to the environment, whether your ancestors come from a very sunny, very warm place, or whether your ancestors come from a colder, rainier, less sunny place. And a lot of the traits that we think of as kind of markers of a certain race or another are really adaptations to an environment. Um, if you talk to a biologist and you talk about race in other animals, what you would find is that a race of animals is a group of animals who have been separated out from the larger population. Okay, so they're separate from the larger population. They can't access them. They can't breed, and sort of over time, this little population of animals eventually may evolve into its own species. It may become different enough to become a different species. But that's really never been the case with humans. No humans have really ever been physically or geographically isolated from each other. If there's one thing humans are very good at, it's moving around. Humans evolved in Africa probably about 300,000 years ago, but we very quickly, not very quickly, but eventually we left Africa and spread throughout the whole world. And after we did that, we continued to move around and interact with other populations. And so humanity has always been kind of one interconnected pod of people. We've never been separated out in any obvious way. And so as a result, there's really no such thing as biological race in human beings. And in fact, what scientists have found is that there is more genetic variability within a certain race than between them. Okay, and so Karen, if you don't mind me asking or using you as an example here, Karen and I are obviously, we look very different. My ancestors are from Northern Europe. Karen, I'm going to make an assumption that yours are from Africa. But the interesting thing is that because of how similar humans are genetically, Karen and I might be more similar to each other than, say, Sarah and me. Even though Sarah's ancestors are European, I'm talking about Sarah Scally, the principal. Sarah's are European, and so in theory you would think we would be more similar, and Karen and I would be less similar. But in fact, that might not be the case, right? It could be that Karen and I are more genetically similar than Sarah and I. And again, that's because humans are one race. We're not that genetically different, and the things that we see as different, things that our eyes see as different, like our skin color or the shape of our eyes or whatever, the differences that we see are really only a handful of genes. They're not they don't amount to that much of a difference when you have hundreds of thousands of genes that encode who we are. The couple of genes that encode our skin color are just not that important. And so for visual creatures like humans, skin color seems to be a big thing. But if you look at the genes and the genetics behind it, they're not really that much of a difference. And again, they have to do with environment more than anything else. And so this is where those of you who said that race is not meaningful, this is where you're correct. It isn't actually meaningful because there really are no biological human races. There's only one of us. And the reason why we look different has to do with the environments that our ancestors came from. And so, again, the example I'll use is that my ancestors came from a place that was cold and rainy and not very sunny. And so we kind of wound up with this see-through skin that allows sunlight to come in and synthesize vitamin D. And of course, if you come from a country that's closer to or if your ancestors come from a country that's closer to the equator where it's warmer and sunnier, letting sun in isn't your problem. Your problem is blocking out some of the UV rays. And so people from equatorial regions tend to have darker skin for that reason. But it's simply an environmental adaptation. It's not, it doesn't really have any significance beyond that. So again, for those of you who said race is not meaningful, this is where you're correct. Biologically speaking, it's not a thing. We're basically all, genetically speaking, we're almost all the same. I want to hit pause for a second there. Are you okay so far? Is there anything that I've said that's confusing or doesn't fit with your experience, or that you have questions about, or if you want to challenge anything I said, you can do that too, because you're allowed to. What do you think? Are you okay? Are you not okay? What do you think? Okay, so Karen's good. Is anyone else out there? Hello? There's at least 14 of you. KC is good. Okay. How are you kind of okay, Baha? Eric is good. Sam's good. Ooh, everything's perfect. Ooh. All right, good for you. Sheet is good. Jenna's good. Okay, if you have questions, just throw them up in there. I'll answer them, I promise. Yeah, so again, genetically speaking, there's no such thing as race, right? We've never been geographically isolated. Humans have always migrated around and mixed with other humans. There's really no sort of genetic separation between us. And so genetically speaking, we're almost all the same person. Yeah, so the way in which we define races in terms of physical appearance, those physical appearances are just not that big a deal genetically, right? As a species, we share 99.9% of our DNA with each other. And so all of you who are sitting out there listening to me, everyone in this class is 99.9% genetically similar. So again, the differences that are there are just not that big of a deal, genetically speaking, okay? And again, many of the differences that do exist have to do with the environments that our ancestors came from. And so what the climate was like and what kind of foods they ate, those have had some influence on our genome. But again, the differences are very, very minor. They're not a big deal. Yeah, and so again, the ways in which we're similar genetically are far more important than the ways we're genetically different. And so again, those of you who thought that race is not meaningful, yeah, you're right. It's not a thing genetically, biologically. But for those of you who said race is meaningful, you are also right. And again, you're correct because race is something that is socially constructed. And as we know from humans, as we know from what we've learned already, things that are socially constructed are meaningful and powerful in society. It doesn't matter, like when we talked about social rules and social norms, it doesn't matter if the rules are made up, right? It doesn't matter if they're imaginary because humans will act as if they're real anyway. And so race is something that is socially constructed. It's something that we have imagined for ourselves. And even though it's not biologically real, if we treat it as biologically real, it becomes meaningful, it becomes powerful, and it affects people's lives in very significant ways. And so, again, if you said that race was meaningful, you're right, because the fact that people believe in racial differences has a real effect on people's lives, okay? And so it is meaningful in this way. So obviously here in North America, white people are the dominant group, and non-white people we kind of put into this category called people of color. And people of color isn't a great term because people of color have lots of different experiences in society. And so here in Canadian society, you could be anyone who is not white could be a person of color. And so you could be black, you could be from South Asia or India, you could be from Southeast Asia or China, you could be an indigenous person, you could be a black person who's born here in Canada and be nationally, culturally Canadian. You could be a black person who's recently come from Africa or from some other part of the world. Those are all different experiences, okay? Those people have different experiences depending on the race that society kind of gives to them, ascribes to them. They're all different in terms of their ethnicity, and again, they're different in terms of their experience in society. And so a Chinese person or a black person from Africa who's recently come to Canada, and an indigenous person who has lived in Canada their entire lives, those are all included in sort of peoples of color, but they're not the same experience, right? These people have totally different experiences. And so to say people of color is an overly general term, but we still use it anyway to define anyone who's not in the dominant group, okay? So the question you might ask is, okay, race is not biologically meaningful. We have a few genetic differences. Some of those genetic differences change the way we look in terms of our skin color or whatnot. But genetically, it's not a thing. However, race is socially constructed, and because it's socially constructed and people believe in these ideas, they have significant impacts on people's lives. And so the question, of course, is, if race is socially constructed, why did people construct this in the first place, right? Where did these ideas come from? Why do we have the racial inequalities and racial stereotypes and racial prejudice that we currently have? Where does it come from and why? Okay. So to explain that question, I have an article for you to read. And so I have uploaded it onto Student Portal. It's called Understanding Racism. And then there's some questions. Actually, the questions aren't at the end of the article. They're in a separate document, which is also on Student Portal. So sorry about that. Both of them are also on Microsoft Teams, so you can see them there. Now I'd like you to read this, but before I do, I want to just press pause on that. And I want to ask you about the micropaper assignment. And so can you guys in the live chat here, can you give me a bit of a feeling about where you are with that? Have you started it? Have you not started it? Are you putting it off because you don't want to do it? Are you partway there? Are you totally confused and need help? Can you give me a little bit of a feeling of where you are with that, so that I can either relax, or if I can't relax, then I can do something to assist you in some way? Okay, so Baha says, I'm just looking for an article and I need help. Okay. Karen sent it. Okay, you sent it. Yeah, I saw that in my email yesterday, Karen. I just didn't get to it yet. So, okay, that's cool. Thank you. What else? Be honest, because I can't help you if you're not honest. Okay, so Casey has started it, so far so good, I'm hoping. Let's see. More. Looking for the article can be is the toughest part. Um, okay, so far so good for Casey. Um, Looking for the article is kind of the toughest part because there's kind of a number of skills going on in terms of learning how to find good material, knowing it when you see it, having it be credible, having it be the right length. You don't want something too short, but you don't want something super, super long. You want something with an argument. You want something that's connected to stereotypes or prejudice or discrimination. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of once you kind of learn how to find these things, it becomes much easier to just sort of go through and find this stuff. But at first, it's not so easy. I understand that. Getting started on it today, still understanding what to do. Okay, that's all right. This is part of the struggle is kind of figuring out how to do it. Okay, and it's going to be okay. But don't panic. Okay, so you're starting it today. Okay. Maybe what I'll do. I'm hoping to hear more. There's still about 10 of you who haven't responded. I will leave it for today, but maybe I'll speak to it a little bit tomorrow, and maybe what I'll do is I'll look for an article live. I'll let you see my screen, and I'll just kind of go through things, and I'll sort of narrate it. I'll let you know kind of what I'm thinking about and how I do it. Would that be useful? If I went through the steps of kind of finding an article and I talked through it, would that be useful to you guys or not so much? Casey says yes with an extra S, which I'm guessing that means like even more yes. Whoa. Okay, that's a super yes. Super yes. Mashid says yes. Mashid, you've got an article already, and it's good, I think. Manish says help a lot. Okay. Erica says yes. All right. Okay, so maybe I'll prepare to do that tomorrow. So tomorrow, first thing, I'll take you through that. You'll be able to see my computer screen, and I will look for an article live, and hopefully I won't embarrass myself. Hopefully I'll be able to find something fairly quick, and it will make sense to you, and I'll kind of talk my way through it. Okay, so that's what I'll do first thing tomorrow, and again, hopefully it'll go well, and hopefully I won't embarrass myself. I won't practice ahead of time, so I won't find an article tonight and then just like pretend that I found it tomorrow. I'll actually do it. So that's a little scary, but hopefully it'll work. Okay, so that's what I'll do tomorrow. I will find an article live on the air, and we'll see how that goes. Okay. All right. So back to our article here. So I have an article for you to read. I have some questions. Again, they're not at the end of the article. They're in a different document, but they're called Understanding Racism as well. They're both on Student Portal and on Microsoft Teams. They're in both places. And so I'd like you to read the article, and I'd like you to answer the questions. Now, the article does kind of three things. The article talks a little bit about definitions, and so it talks about what racism is, what ethnicity is, what structural racism is. And then it talks a little bit about the social construction of race. And so, again, that's the question that we just asked. If if race is a made-up thing, why did people make it up in the first place? Why do we have this set of beliefs around people who look different? Okay, and so it talks about the social construction of race in the United States, talks about the social construction of race in Canada, and you'll see that both of those processes are different but similar. Okay, so they have some commonalities, but they also have some difference, because the US and Canada, I don't know what you know about US history and Canadian history. We are different countries. We have different histories. Some things we have in common and some things we don't. And so the process has been a little bit different, but race has been constructed in kind of similar ways in both countries. Okay, so there's a little bit at the beginning that's kind of definitions. There's a section on how and why these racial distinctions were created in the United States, and a little bit about how racial distinctions were created in Canada. And so we'll try to expand on both of those things in the next week or so. So this is just kind of a brief overview, okay? Okay, so maybe what I'll do then is I'll turn you loose and let you read that article and work on the questions. Again, it's in Microsoft Teams under Files, and it's on Student Portal under Course Documents. Read the article, answer the questions. That'll take you to the end of class. And then tomorrow, first thing, I'll find an article, and hopefully that'll work, fingers crossed. And then we'll continue on with this article here, okay? So any questions before we break, or are we good? Okay, sir. Oof, formal. Yeah, are we okay with that? Okay, so Karen's fine, good. KC's okay, all right. Manish is extra perfect with hundreds and all kinds of hand gestures, that's good. You're having a good day, Manish, good for you. Jenna's good. Erica's cool. I know you're cool, Erica. I know. Okay. I think that's good. So I will Manish, you're welcome. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for interacting in the live chat. That's great. Jimmy's good. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for being here. Read the article, answer the questions. Tomorrow I'll take you through finding an article, and then we'll continue with this, okay? So I'll sign off now. I'll see some of you in a little bit in comparative cultures, and the rest of you I'll see tomorrow, okay? So bye.